What if a single email sent from a desk in Washington could instantly freeze your bank card, making it nothing more than a useless piece of plastic? This isn't just a hypothetical question. It's the core of a monumental threat the United States is levying against South Africa. The proposal on the table is to yank the entire country off of SWIFT, the vital messaging network that acts as the planet's circulatory system for money. With a single, decisive click, the South African rand could enter a catastrophic freefall. The price of a loaf of bread could jump by a staggering 25% overnight, and your cousin working in London would find it impossible to send cash home to help the family. This is the new face of international power politics, where financial networks have become the battlefield. Today, we're unpacking the alarming story of how a single American bill, H.R. 2633, could transform South Africa's economy into a real-time, high-stakes stress test for the enduring power of the US dollar. This is a look at how money has become the new artillery, so buckle in. The genesis of this crisis began not with a bang, but with the quiet introduction of legislation. In the corridors of power, in March 2025, Congressman Ronnie Jackson, a Republican from Texas, introduced a bill designated H.R. 2633. To the casual observer, the title and number sound like any other piece of bureaucratic paperwork, easily lost in the shuffle of legislative proceedings. But buried within its dense legal language lies a clause with the power of an economic nuclear weapon, a directive to review and potentially boot all of South Africa's major banks off the SWIFT network. The official justification cited in the bill is a response to Pretoria's hostile foreign policy choices. When translated from diplomatic jargon into plain English, this means the United States has grown tired of what it perceives as South Africa's increasingly cozy relationship with Russia and its enthusiastic participation in the BRICS Club of Nations, a bloc often seen as a counterweight to Western-led institutions. To truly grasp the gravity of this threat, one must understand what SWIFT is and what it is not. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication isn't a bank. It doesn't hold any funds or manage any accounts. Instead, it is a 50-year-old Belgian cooperative that functions as a hyper-secure messaging service, a kind of digital courier for the global financial system. It sends standardized, trusted, move the money notes between its staggering 11,000 member institutions across the globe. These messages are the lifeblood of international trade. Yet, if a country's banks are denied access to these secure notes, it's like being kicked out of the world's most exclusive group chat, where trillions of dollars are discussed and moved every day. Without SWIFT, every shipment of South African coal destined for Asia, every case of celebrated Pinotage wine heading to Europe, and every component part imported for its auto industry is left stranded, forced to find a new, untested, and likely non-existent courier. In the modern globalized economy, there is currently no viable, large-scale alternative. Washington's frustration has been simmering for years, fueled by a list of grievances that U.S. lawmakers argue demonstrate Pretoria's drift away from its traditional Western partners. 4 specific complaints have repeatedly been cited as reasons for this dramatic legislative push. First, South Africa's hosting of the 2023 BRICS Summit, where it enthusiastically cheered the expansion of the bloc to include new members, was seen in Washington as a direct challenge to the G7's global influence. Second, Pretoria's steadfast refusal to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine, insisting on a posture of non-alignment, has been interpreted not as neutrality, but as tacit support for Moscow. Third, the decision last year to allow Russian and Chinese warships to conduct joint military exercises, dubbed Operation Mosey, off its extensive coastline, sent a particularly jarring signal to Western military planners. Finally, ongoing domestic political discussions within South Africa about the possibility of seizing farmland without compensation have deeply spooked American and other foreign investors, including powerful U.S. pension funds with significant holdings in the country. The 30% tariff slapped on South African steel in January was just the appetizer, a warning shot across the bow. The threat of a swift disconnection is the main course, a full-throated display of economic force. The immediate economic shockwave from a swift ban would be devastating. A full 70% of South Africa's exports, the very engine of its economy, are priced and settled in US dollars. Losing access to the primary network for clearing these transactions would force all of that trade into a chaotic and costly detour. Exporters and importers would have to desperately search for friendly intermediary banks, perhaps in financial hubs like Dubai or Singapore, that would be willing to touch the business, all while charging a premium for the added risk and complexity. Domestically, the country's big four banks, Standard Bank, First Rand, Nedbank, and Absa, would face a terrifying and immediate liquidity crunch. Their American correspondent banking partners, crucial for overnight lending and dollar clearing, would almost certainly pull their lines of credit to avoid falling foul of U.S. sanctions. To stave off a complete collapse of the financial system, the South African Reserve Bank would be forced to burn through its precious foreign exchange reserves at an alarming rate, simply to keep the lights on and guarantee essential payments. Even with such interventions, market analysts predict the rand could plummet by another 15% or more within a single week. This currency collapse would cause the prices of imported necessities like fuel and wheat to surge, hitting the wallets of ordinary citizens with brutal force. For a nation already wrestling with crippling rolling blackouts and a staggering official unemployment rate of 32%, such a shock represents a social powder keg, threatening to ignite widespread unrest. The historical precedents for such an action are both clear and terrifying. When Iran was fully disconnected from SWIFT in 2012 over its nuclear program, its currency, the rial, lost an astonishing 90% of its value over the subsequent 3 years, plunging the nation into economic isolation. More recently, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, many major Russian banks were kicked off the network. The ruble immediately lost 30% of its value in just 2 weeks. Russia, however, had two advantages South Africa lacks. It is a major global supplier of a single fungible commodity, oil, and it had been preparing for this eventuality for years. It scrambled to build a clunky, homegrown alternative messaging system called SPFS and leaned heavily on China's yuan for the trade it could salvage. But South Africa's economy is fundamentally different. It doesn't just sell oil. It sells complex manufactured goods like BMW parts, platinum catalysts, and perishable agricultural products like citrus. As the script wryly notes, you can try rerouting a container of oranges through an informal hawala payment system. But there's a spoiler. They rot long before they reach their destination. The logistical complexity of South Africa's trade makes it uniquely vulnerable. Behind the closed doors of Johannesburg's financial district, this threat has already triggered a quiet panic. The country's top bankers and financial strategists have been wargaming scenarios and sketching out a plan B. The most plausible emergency strategy involves attempting to funnel trade payments through their existing branches in more neutral jurisdictions, such as Dubai, and trying to patch into China's nascent cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. However, this is far from a silver bullet. The trouble is that CIPS is a minnow compared to SWIFT's whale, with only around 1,200 member banks compared to SWIFT's 11,000. More critically, for any transactions that eventually need to be converted back into US dollars, which covers the vast majority of South Africa's trade, CIPS still often relies on the very US correspondent banks that South Africa would be barred from accessing. In candid, off-the-record conversations, the bankers themselves admit this strategy is nothing more than a flimsy band-aid, wholly inadequate to staunch the bleeding from the wound a full swift exclusion would inflict. It's a desperate measure, not a sustainable cure. While economists model the macroeconomic fallout, the true cost of this financial warfare would be paid by ordinary people. For the freelance graphic designer in Cape Town who depends on international clients, the reality would be immediate. Your PayPal or Payoneer account, which already sometimes freezes Rand withdrawals citing compliance reviews, would become permanently locked. The vital flow of remittances, amounting to over $1.7 billion a year sent home by the diaspora, would dry to a trickle, leaving countless families without a critical lifeline. At the pump, the price of gasoline would jump overnight as fuel is priced and purchased on global markets in dollars. The cost of data and internet access would spike as the undersea cables that connect Africa to the world bill for their services in dollars. Suddenly, a loaf of bread, a staple food, could cost what 2 loaves did the week before. In a country where nearly half the population already experiences food insecurity and regularly skips meals, this is not just an abstract statistic. It is the recipe for a riot, a humanitarian crisis waiting to happen. The abstract language of sanctions, debated in spreadsheets and policy papers, translates directly into empty shelves, missed futures, and the crushing weight of poverty on the ground. On the grand diplomatic chessboard, Washington's move is anything but subtle. It's a clear and potent message being sent not just to Pretoria, but to every other capital in the global south, particularly in Africa. Nations like Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana, all of whom have been watching the rise of the BRICS and considering a closer alignment, are now taking careful notes. The message is simple. If you side with Russia and China, you risk suffering the same economic fate. The diplomatic chill is already palpable. A South African envoy was dispatched to Washington, D.C. last month in a frantic attempt to de-escalate, reportedly offering to implement tighter export controls on any dual-use technologies that might find their way to Russia's war effort. According to sources, he flew home with little more than polite smiles and non-committal promises. The gears of the sanctions machine are already in motion. Faced with this existential threat, a desperate Pretoria might look to its BRICS partners, Russia and China, for a safety net. But that net appears to be full of holes. Russia can offer discounted oil, but South Africa's aging refineries are already running at capacity and are themselves in desperate need of spare parts that must be purchased with hard currency dollars. China, a far more significant economic power, could theoretically open a massive yuan swap line to facilitate trade. Yet, Chinese state-owned banks are intensely pragmatic and deeply integrated into the global financial system. They remain profoundly fearful of secondary sanctions, where the U.S. punishes them for doing business with a sanctioned entity. The BRICS' own new development bank could offer a loan of a few $billion. But this is mere pocket change compared to the tens of billions that would be required to stabilize the economy. Firepower that only institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the U.S. Federal Reserve's repo markets can provide. It is crucial to place this potential action in its proper context. This is the nuclear option of financial sanctions. To date, only Iran and North Korea have been fully and comprehensively banned from SWIFT. Even Russia, a primary geopolitical adversary, has only been partially disconnected, with carve-outs for energy payments. South Africa, a G20 member and a constitutional democracy, would be the first middle-income, globally integrated economy to receive such a sentence. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange, JSE, is Africa's largest and most liquid. The rand is a fully convertible currency. Banning such a country sends a chilling message to international investors everywhere. Even relatively stable, democratic markets can be unplugged from the global grid at a moment's notice if their foreign policy displeases Washington. The ripple effects would be immediate, likely triggering a wave of regional capital flight. Currencies from the Ghanaian cedi to the Zambian kwacha would wobble violently on the mere rumor, as investors scramble to pull their money out of a region suddenly deemed too risky. Pretoria, however, is not entirely without leverage and could choose to play dirty in response. It holds some powerful cards of its own. It could threaten to revoke the lucrative mining licenses of major US and European firms that extract the country's vast mineral wealth, including platinum and chromium, which are vital for Western industries. It could even make good on the controversial threat to expropriate farmland, specifically targeting parcels owned by American pension funds and institutional investors. On a more constructive front, South Africa could accelerate its work with the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, to fast-track the development of the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PASSIS. This system is designed to allow African nations to trade with each other using their own local currencies, bypassing the need for the dollar altogether. While it would not replace SWIFT for global trade, it would make Uncle Sam's ability to project power on the continent significantly harder in the long run. Ultimately, the stakes of this confrontation extend far beyond the borders of South Africa. They touch upon the very structure of the emerging global order. Every time a sanction like this is wielded, it serves as a powerful advertisement for building alternatives to the dollar-dominated financial system. This is a trend that is already well underway. The European Union created a special purpose vehicle called Instex to try and salvage trade with Iran. China is pouring resources into its CIPS network. Russia is pushing its SPFS. Meanwhile, central banks from Ankara to Brasilia to Beijing are steadily increasing their reserves of gold and Chinese yuan, hedging their bets against the dollar. By making an example of South Africa, Washington risks dramatically accelerating this splintering of the global financial commons. In a deep irony, by overusing its most powerful weapon, America may be hastening the day that weapon becomes obsolete. The clock is ticking loudly. The U.S. Congress is set to return from its recess in September, and the bill to sanction South Africa reportedly has influential supporters on both sides of the aisle, appealing to both anti-Russia hawks and China skeptics. If the bill passes and is signed into law, it gives the U.S. Treasury a 90-day window to make a final determination. Behind the curtain, a frantic diplomatic dance is underway. Pretoria is said to be dangling votes in favor of future UN resolutions condemning Russia and offering tighter regulations on Wegener-linked mining operations in Africa. The White House, in turn, is torn between competing domestic interests: the anti-BRICS foreign policy hawks centered in states like Florida, and powerful industrial lobbies like Michigan's auto sector, which are terrified of losing access to South African platinum and other essential components. As the deadline approaches, the world watches, and South Africa faces three possible doors to its future. Door number one represents a last-minute deal, a diplomatic off-ramp, where a memorandum of understanding is signed. Swift access is preserved, and perhaps the existing steel tariffs remain as a slap on the wrist. Door number two is the path of half measures, a scenario where only specific state-owned banks are banned, allowing the private sector banks to limp along and maintain a fractured connection to the global economy. And then there is door number three, the full, unconditional ban. In this future, an IMF emergency mission lands at OR Tambo Airport as the rand is in complete free fall. And the history books gain a chilling new chapter on the devastating power of weaponized finance. Cutting South Africa off from SWIFT is not just another sanction on a growing list. It is a live-fire demonstration of how money, data, and networks have become the new artillery in 21st century geopolitics. For the policymakers in Washington, this is a calculated, if risky, move to punish a drifting ally and enforce geopolitical discipline. For the government in Pretoria, it is an existential battle for economic survival. And for the rest of the world, it is a stark and unsettling preview of the coming fracture in global finance. Whether South Africa is ultimately forced to bend the knee, or whether it breaks under the pressure, the outcome will not only decide its own future, it will send a powerful signal about how the next century will be defined by the struggle over money, power, and the fragile international trust that keeps our interconnected world humming.